Xavier Paxton could always tell the time of day by the light that filtered through the dust-filled air of the Owens-Illinois glass plant. 5:30 in the morning had a blue-gray quality, like dawn was still thinking about whether to fully commit. The machines were already humming, the furnaces roaring at temperatures that could melt a man down to nothing in seconds. The noise was such a constant that his wife, Alice, said he couldn't hear a tornado if it tore the roof off their house. But Xavier heard what mattered. The subtle changes in pitch when something was about to go wrong with the IS machine, the different tones the bottles made when they clinked against each other on the conveyor. Good ones rang clear, defective ones made a dull thud. It was September 1982, and Xavier had worked at the Owens-Illinois plant in Toledo for 27 years. Started when he was 19, right after his father got him the job. This place had paid for his modest 3-bedroom on Westbrook Drive, the boat that sat under a tarp in his driveway 9 months a year, his daughter's braces, and the college fund that might finally get someone in the Paxton family a degree. The plant wasn't just where he worked, it was who he was. "Morning, Pax," said Denny Coleman, his shift supervisor for the last decade. Denny had circles under his eyes darker than usual. "Morning," Xavier replied, punching his time card with the satisfying chunk of metal against paper. "Line 3 giving you trouble again." Denny forced a smile. "Nah, just the usual. Management wants us in the break room at 2. "Some announcement." Something in Denny's tone made Xavier's stomach tighten. There had been rumors floating around for months. The Newark plant had cut a shift. The Bridgeton facility had laid off 50 people. Corporate headquarters in Toledo didn't guarantee immunity. Sometimes being close to the brain made it easier to cut off a limb. "Probably just another safety lecture," Xavier said, reaching for his gloves. The factory floor sprawled before him like a mechanical organism. The batch house mixed the raw materials, silica sand, soda ash, limestone, and the crushed remnants of recycled glass called cullet. This mixture fed the furnaces that burned white-hot, transforming solid to liquid in a process that hadn't fundamentally changed since humans first discovered glass thousands of years ago. The molten glass flowed to the IS machines, individual section machines, where it was cut, shaped, and blown into bottles and jars that would hold everything from beer to baby food. Xavier worked as a machine operator, managing the complex timing and pressure systems that shaped the glass. Under his supervision, the machines could produce hundreds of bottles per minute, each one identical to the one before. There was satisfaction in that consistency, in watching raw earth become functional objects that would travel across the country, containing the products of other men's labor. He'd always thought there was something magical about glass, how sand and fire could create something both fragile and essential. His section of the line produced beer bottles today, amber glass for Schlitz. The smell of hot glass and machine oil filled his nostrils as he checked the settings, making tiny adjustments that would be invisible to anyone but another operator. His hands moved with the confidence of someone who had performed these actions thousands of times. "Heard anything else?" Xavier asked Mike Trout, who operated the machine beside him. Mike was younger, only been at the plant 15 years, but he had good ears. "Heard things." Mike shook his head, his face glistening with sweat in the heat of the factory. "Nothing concrete. My cousin works in accounting, though. Says there's been suits from New York around lately. Never a good sign." Xavier nodded and turned back to his machine. He didn't want to feed the rumor mill, but he'd noticed things too. Maintenance requests that went unfilled, orders that seemed smaller than normal, the quiet disappearance of the annual company picnic from the calendar. "They can't close this plant," Xavier said, more to himself than to Mike. "Toledo is Owens-Illinois, always has been." The company had been born here in 1903, when Michael Owens invented the automatic bottle machine that revolutionized the glass industry. The Toledo plant was the flagship, the heart of what had grown into a global corporation. Closing it would be like Ford abandoning Detroit. But as the morning wore on, Xavier found himself counting the bottles that passed, calculating production numbers in his head. How many did they make last month compared to the same time last year? Was it enough? The thought bothered him through lunch in the cafeteria, where the conversation seemed subdued, as if everyone was thinking the same thing but no one wanted to say it aloud. At 2 o'clock the shift gathered in the break room. Xavier noticed that all the management had come down from the offices upstairs, including Richard Bartlett, the plant manager, a man who rarely set foot on the factory floor. Bartlett's face was drawn, his normally immaculate suit looking like he'd slept in it. "I appreciate everyone gathering here today," Bartlett began, his voice echoing slightly in the concrete-walled room. "I've been with Owens-Illinois for 32 years, and this is the hardest thing I've ever had to do." Xavier felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "The board of directors has made the decision to significantly downsize our Toledo operations over the next 18 months. Beginning next month, we'll be reducing our workforce by approximately 30%. The remainder of the reductions will occur in phases." The room erupted in shouts and questions. Xavier sat perfectly still, as if movement might make the words more real. "This decision wasn't made lightly," Bartlett continued when the noise died down. "The glass industry is changing. Foreign competition, plastic containers taking market share, energy costs rising. Our older facilities can't compete with newer, more efficient operations. So modernize us," someone called out. "We've always been the proving ground for new technology." Bartlett's face showed genuine pain. "The capital investment required would be significant. The board has determined that resources would be better allocated to our newer facilities." Better allocated, the words tasted bitter in Xavier's mouth. "You mean we're being sacrificed?" Bartlett met his eyes briefly, then looked away. "There will be severance packages. We're working with the union on details. Some of you may have opportunities to relocate to our other plants. Human resources will begin individual consultations next week." The meeting continued, but Xavier barely heard it. His mind raced ahead, calculating mortgage payments and college tuition against whatever severance they might offer. He'd be 46 next month. Who hired 46-year-old glass workers whose only skill was operating machines that existed in fewer and fewer places. After the meeting, the men returned to the line in silence. The bottles continued to form and flow along the conveyor belts, perfect amber cylinders destined to hold beer that would momentarily quench someone's thirst before being discarded. Xavier watched them with new eyes. How many millions of bottles had passed through his hands over the years? How many homes had they entered? How many celebrations had they witnessed? And what would it all amount to when the machines went silent? The end of his shift came and Xavier punched out mechanically. In the parking lot, men gathered in small groups, talking in low voices, some already making plans, others still in shock. Xavier sat in his Chevy Impala, hands gripping the steering wheel. He didn't turn the key, not yet. Through the windshield, he could see the plant silhouetted against the evening sky. The tall brick smokestack with OI painted in white, the massive warehouse where finished products waited for shipment. The administrative building where men in suits had decided his fate. This place had been as constant in his life as the sun rising. Now it was just another factory on the chopping block. He finally started the car and drove home through the familiar streets of Toledo. The city had grown up around glass, Owens-Illinois, Libby Glass, Owens, Corning. The Glass City, they called it. What would it be when the glass was gone? At home, his wife Audrey was in the kitchen, the radio playing softly as she prepared dinner. She looked up when he entered, her smile fading as she saw his face. "Xav, what is it?" He sat heavily at the kitchen table. "They're closing the plant. Not all at once, but it's starting. 30% cuts next month." Audrey set down the knife she'd been using to chop onions and wiped her hands on her apron. "Will you?" "I don't know yet. Seniority might save me in this round, might not." She sat across from him and took his hands. Her fingers were warm and slightly damp. "We'll figure it out, we always do." Xavier nodded, but inside he felt hollow. Audrey had married a provider, a man who never missed a day's work, who could fix anything that broke, who had plans for his daughter's future. Who would he be if that was taken away? "Does Amanda know?" Audrey asked. "No. She's at practice until 6. Their daughter was 17, a senior in high school with dreams of becoming a veterinarian. Her college fund would cover the first year, maybe part of the second. After that, "Let's wait to tell her," Audrey said, "until we know more." That night, Xavier lay awake long after Audrey's breathing had become deep and regular beside him. The house creaked and settled around him, familiar sounds that had never bothered him before. Now each one seemed like a warning, the structure itself anticipating the strain to come. The next morning, he rose before dawn as always. For a moment, standing in the dark of his bedroom, he considered crawling back into bed, calling in sick for the first time in years. What was the point? But habit propelled him forward. He showered, dressed, ate the eggs and toast Audrey prepared. He kissed her goodbye as if it were any other day. At the plant, the atmosphere had changed overnight. Men who had joked together for decades now eyed each other as competition. Who would survive the cuts, who had more seniority, whose skills were more valuable. Xavier felt it too, this new lens through which he assessed his coworkers. Tom Rhodes had 4 kids but had only been at the plant 12 years. Mike Trout was younger but had specialized training on the newer equipment. Denny Coleman was management, but even they weren't safe. The machines ran as they always had. The glass flowed, bottles formed, defects were culled, good product packaged. But beneath the normal rhythm of work, Xavier sensed the current of fear. It reminded him of when he was a boy and had fallen through the ice on the Maumee River. That moment of realizing the solid world beneath you was gone, replaced by cold that stole your breath. That weekend, Xavier took his boat out on Lake Erie. The September day was perfect, warm sun, gentle breeze, the water deep blue against the horizon. He'd bought the boat second-hand when Amanda was 7, a 16-foot Starcraft with a 90-horsepower Johnson outboard. Nothing fancy, but it was his, paid for with overtime hours during the oil crisis when glass demand had soared. He cut the engine in a quiet cove and let the boat drift. Fish jumped occasionally, leaving expanding circles on the water's surface. Overhead, gulls wheeled and cried. Xavier opened a beer Schlitz from a bottle he might have helped make and tried to enjoy the moment. But his mind kept returning to the plant, to the faces of the men who had become his second family. When he returned home, Amanda was washing her car in the driveway, the radio blasting Madonna. His daughter had her mother's features but his stubborn determination. She waved as he pulled in, water dripping from the sponge in her hand. "Hey Dad, how was the lake?" "Good, caught a few walleye." He held up the cooler with his catch. "Nice, Mom said she'd make fish for dinner if you brought some back." Xavier placed the cooler in the shade and grabbed another sponge to help. They worked together on the old Honda Civic he'd bought her for her 16th birthday, a practical car that wouldn't attract boys or cost much to maintain. "Dad, can I ask you something?" Amanda said as they rinsed the soap off the hood. "Sure, sweetheart." "Is something wrong at work? Mom's been acting weird, and I heard her on the phone talking about resumed services." Xavier paused, water running over his hands from the hose. He'd wanted to protect her from this, at least until he knew more, but Amanda wasn't a child anymore. The company's downsizing the plant, starting next month. Amanda's eyes widened. "Are you going to lose your job?" "I don't know yet, I have seniority, but," he shrugged, "nothing's guaranteed." "What about college? I've already applied to Ohio State and Michigan State." Xavier turned off the hose and faced his daughter. "We'll figure it out, your education comes first, always has." Amanda nodded, but he could see the worry settling into her young face, the same shadow he'd noticed around the plant, the same shadow that followed him home each night. The next week, Human Resources began calling people in alphabetically. The PS would come on Thursday. Xavier worked his shift in a strange limbo, watching bottles flow past while mentally cataloging his skills, his contacts, his options. A few men had already cleaned out their lockers, taking the news stoically or raging against the company, depending on their natures. Wednesday evening, he sat at the kitchen table with Audrey, papers spread before them. Bank statements, mortgage documents, insurance policies, Amanda's college brochures. They made calculations, considered scenarios. "I could go back to work," Audrey said. She'd been a secretary before Amanda was born but had stayed home since. Mercy Hospital is always hiring. Xavier shook his head. "Let's see what happens first. If I make the cut, we can get by a while longer, save more. And if you don't?" He had no answer for that. Thursday arrived with a heavy fog that shrouded the plant, making the massive structure look ghostly and indistinct. Xavier arrived early, as was his habit. In the locker room, he changed into his work clothes methodically, steel-toed boots, heavy cotton pants, long-sleeved shirt despite the heat, gloves tucked into his pocket for when he reached the floor. Denny found him at his station an hour into the shift. They want to see you upstairs, 9:30. Xavier nodded, his mouth suddenly dry. Thanks. The hours until 9:30 crawled by. Xavier worked automatically, his body knowing what to do even as his mind raced elsewhere. At 9:20, he handed control to his relief man and walked toward the staircase that led to the administrative offices. The second floor was another world, carpeted, air-conditioned, quiet. Xavier felt conspicuous in his work clothes, aware of the glass dust in the creases of his skin, the machine oil under his fingernails. A secretary directed him to a small conference room where Richard Bartlett sat with a woman Xavier didn't recognize, her navy suit crisp, her face professionally sympathetic. "Mr. Paxton, please have a seat," she said. "I'm Alina Reed from Corporate Human Resources." Xavier sat stiffly in the offered chair. There was a folder in front of her with his name on it. "First, I want to thank you for your years of dedicated service," she began. 27 years is a remarkable commitment. Past tense, already talking about him like he was gone. "We've had to make some very difficult decisions in determining which positions to maintain during this transitional period." She opened the folder. "Based on your seniority and performance record, we're offering you a choice." Xavier's heart skipped. A choice meant options. Options meant hope. You can accept a severance package, 1 week's pay for every year of service, health insurance coverage for 6 months, and outplacement assistance. Or, she paused, glancing at Bartlett, you can accept a transfer to our plant in Alton, Illinois. Same position, slightly lower pay scale reflective of the cost of living difference, but full continuation of benefits and seniority. Alton, Illinois. Xavier had never been there, couldn't even picture where it was on a map. Somewhere on the Mississippi, he thought. How much lower? He asked. About 12% reduction in base pay. The cost of living is approximately 15% lower there, so you should come out ahead. Xavier did the mental calculation. A smaller paycheck in a strange city versus no paycheck in the place he'd lived his entire life. When would I have to decide? We need your answer by next Wednesday, Bartlett said, speaking for the first time. The transfer would take effect in December. December, that's Amanda is in the middle of her senior year. Bartlett looked genuinely regretful. I know it's not ideal timing, Mr. Paxton, but the alternative is the severance package. Xavier left the meeting with a thick envelope of information, details about Alton, the severance options, forms to fill out regardless of his choice. In the bathroom, he splashed cold water on his face and stared at himself in the mirror. The man who looked back had more gray in his hair than he remembered, deeper lines around his eyes. When had that happened? He finished his shift in a fog, his body going through familiar motions while his mind traveled to Alton, imagining streets he'd never seen, a factory he'd never entered, a life he'd never planned for. At home, he laid everything out for Audrey. They sat at the kitchen table, their unofficial meeting place for all major decisions, and examined the options. Alton doesn't sound so bad, Audrey said, looking at the company brochure with its photos of a small city on a bluff overlooking the Mississippi. And we'd still have your benefits, your pension. What about Amanda? It's her senior year. All her friends are here. And what about your mother? Xavier asked. Audrey's mother lived across town, a widow who depended on them for help with home repairs and doctor's appointments. Mom would understand, and Amanda, Audrey sighed. She'd adjust, kids do, but she wouldn't be happy about it. They were still discussing it when Amanda came home from her after-school job at the veterinary clinic. She knew immediately something was wrong, looking from her father's face to the papers on the table. Dad, are you? I've been offered a transfer to Illinois. Amanda sat heavily in the third chair. Illinois. When? December. But I can't leave in the middle of senior year. What about graduation? What about my friends? Xavier exchanged a look with Audrey. The alternative is I take a severance package. Which means unemployment after that runs out, and no health insurance after 6 months. So we stay here and you find another job, Amanda said as if it were the simplest solution in the world. Jobs like mine aren't exactly plentiful these days, especially for someone my age. The whole industry is contracting. Then something else. Anything, we can't just leave Toledo. This is our home. Xavier understood her distress. At 17, friends were everything. The thought of starting over in a new school for just a few months before graduation seemed impossibly cruel. But adults had to make harder calculations. "We'll talk more tomorrow," Audrey said, ending the discussion as Amanda's eyes filled with tears. "Nothing has to be decided tonight." That night Xavier lay awake again, listening to the occasional car passing on their quiet street. Next to him, Audrey's breathing wasn't the deep rhythm of sleep either. "What are you thinking?" he asked softly. "That I never thought we'd leave Toledo," she answered. "My whole family is here." "Yours too." "I know. But we have to do what's best for Amanda's future, if that means Illinois." Xavier stared at the ceiling, barely visible in the darkness. "What if it's not what's best? What if I'm just afraid? Afraid of starting over at 46, afraid of not being the provider anymore." Audrey rolled toward him, her hand finding his in the dark. "You're more than your job, Xav, you always have been." But was he? For 27 years, his identity had been bound up in those machines, in the rhythm of the factory, in the satisfaction of watching raw materials become essential products. Who was Xavier Paxton without Owens-Illinois? He wasn't sure he knew anymore. The next day was Saturday. Xavier rose early out of habit, though there was no shift to work. He made coffee and sat on the back porch, watching the sky lighten over the neighbor's roof. The air had the first hint of autumn crispness, a reminder that winter wasn't far behind. Winter in a new place if they went. He was still there when Amanda came out, wrapped in her bathrobe, hair tousled from sleep. "Dad, can we talk?" She sat beside him on the porch steps, clutching her coffee mug with both hands. "I've been thinking about Illinois," she said, "and I still hate the idea, but I hate the idea of you being unemployed more." Xavier put his arm around her shoulders. "I'm supposed to be the one worrying about you, not the other way around. I'm almost an adult. We're supposed to worry about each other." She leaned her head against him. "What if I stayed here, finished school while you and Mom go ahead to Illinois? I could live with Aunt Karen." Xavier considered it. His sister Karen would probably agree. But the thought of leaving his daughter behind, even temporarily, made something twist painfully in his chest. "Let's keep that as a last resort," he said. "I've got a few more days to decide. Maybe there are options we haven't thought of yet." Monday morning, Xavier returned to work. The mood in the plant was somber. More lockers had been emptied over the weekend. More faces were missing from the line. Those who remained worked with a kind of desperate efficiency, as if productivity might save them. At lunch, Xavier sat with Mike Trout and a few others who had survived the first round of cuts. "What are you going to do, Pax?" Mike asked. "Take the package or head west?" "Illinois is technically east of here," Xavier corrected automatically, "and I don't know yet, you." "Taking the money and running," Mike said. "My brother's got a construction business in Columbus, says he can use me." The others shared their plans. One was accepting a transfer to a plant in Georgia, another was considering early retirement, a third was talking about opening a bar with his severance money. None seemed particularly happy with their choices, but they were moving forward. Adaptation was a human survival skill, after all. After work, Xavier drove to the university instead of going straight home. Toledo University's campus was busy with students moving between classes, their faces young and full of possibility. He found his way to the financial aid office and waited his turn to speak with a counselor. "My daughter's considering applying here," he explained when he finally sat across from a young woman with a name tag that read Melissa. "I'm trying to understand our options if my employment situation changes." Melissa walked him through possibilities: scholarships, grants, loans, work-study programs. Xavier took notes, asked questions, calculated costs against potential resources. By the time he left, the sky was darkening, but he felt a plan beginning to form. At home, he called a family meeting. Audrey and Amanda sat expectantly at the kitchen table, the scene of so many important discussions. "I've been thinking about what matters most," Xavier began, "and it's not where we live, it's not even the job itself. It's what the job provides: security, opportunity, a future, especially for Amanda." He laid out the financial aid information he'd gathered. "If we take the transfer to Alton, we keep the income, the benefits, the pension. We'd have to uproot, but we'd be together. If I take the severance and stay, we have temporary cushion but long-term uncertainty." What if there's a third option? Audrey said. Xavier and Amanda both looked at her in surprise. What if Amanda stays with Karen to finish high school and I stay too? You go to Alton alone, get established, send money home. We join you after graduation. Xavier hadn't considered this possibility. 6 months apart from his family seemed unimaginable, and yet, I could come home some weekends, he said slowly. It's what, a 7-hour drive? Amanda looked between her parents. You do that. Live apart for 6 months. If it means you get to graduate with your class and we maintain financial stability, yes, Audrey said firmly. It's not ideal, but nothing about this situation is. The plan took shape over the next few days. Karen readily agreed to let Amanda stay with her. Audrey would keep their house running, perhaps find part-time work now that she wouldn't be moving immediately. Xavier would go to Alton in December, find an apartment, and establish himself at the new plant. They would reunite in June after Amanda's graduation. On Wednesday morning, Xavier returned to the conference room where Alina Reed waited with his paperwork. I'll accept the transfer, he said, signing the form she pushed toward him, but I need to discuss some logistics about my family situation. Reed was surprisingly accommodating once she understood the circumstances. The company would provide temporary housing for the first month, help with relocation expenses when his family joined him, and allow flexible scheduling for occasional long weekends back in Toledo. As Xavier left the administrative offices for the last time, he felt a strange mix of relief and apprehension. He had a job, his family had a plan. It wasn't the future they'd imagined, but it was a future nonetheless. The next 3 months passed in a blur of preparation. Xavier and Audrey sold the boat to create an emergency fund. They meticulously budgeted for 2 households, his sparse existence in Alton, the family's continued life in Toledo. Amanda applied to colleges, including some in Illinois and Missouri that might make more sense now. Xavier trained his replacement on the line, a younger man transferred from another department who listened attentively but would never fully understand the subtleties Xavier had mastered over decades. The plant continued its slow dismantling. Equipment was crated for shipment to other facilities. Production lines were consolidated, the workforce dwindled. The parking lot, once filled to capacity every shift, now had empty spaces even during peak hours. December arrived with the first heavy snow of the season. Xavier's last day at the Toledo plant fell on a Friday. He walked through the facility one final time, saying goodbye to machines he'd tended longer than his marriage, longer than his daughter's life. He ran his hand along the control panel of his section, feeling the slight vibration of the mechanisms beneath. This place had been his constant, his certainty in an uncertain world. In the locker room, he cleaned out the small metal box that had held his personal items for 27 years. Work gloves, a spare shirt, a few tools, a faded photo of Audrey and baby Amanda taped inside the door. He closed it for the last time with a metallic clang that sounded like finality. The weekend was devoted to family. They decorated the Christmas tree together, though Xavier wouldn't be there for the holiday itself. They drove around looking at lights, ate at Xavier's favorite restaurants, took photos to sustain them through the separation ahead. Sunday evening, Xavier packed his car with the essentials for his new life, clothes, a few personal items, the small television from Amanda's room that she insisted he take. The rest would remain in Toledo with his family or follow later when they reunited. Monday morning dawned clear and cold. Xavier stood in the driveway with Audrey and Amanda, their breath visible in the December air. Call when you get there, Audrey said, her voice steady though her eyes were wet, and every night after. I will, Xavier hugged her tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. Then he turned to Amanda, who wasn't trying to hide her tears. I'm proud of you, he said, holding his daughter close. So proud. I'm proud of you too, Dad, she whispered. For doing this for us. Xavier got into his car, the engine already running to warm it. Through the windshield, he took one last look at his family standing in front of their home. Then he put the car in drive and began the journey west, leaving behind the only city he'd ever called home. The highway stretched before him, cutting through the flat Ohio landscape. Toledo receded in his rearview mirror, the skyline diminishing with each mile. Xavier thought of the men who had lost their jobs entirely, who had no prospect waiting in Alton or anywhere else. he thought of Richard Bartlett, who had to deliver the news that devastated hundreds of families. He thought of the executives in New York who had made the decision based on spreadsheets and profit margins, never seeing the human cost. But mostly he thought of his father, who had worked at Owens-Illinois before him, who had secured Xavier's job with a word to the foreman back when that's how things were done. His father had believed in the company, in the security it provided, in the fair exchange of loyalty for livelihood. What would he think of this new world where decades of service could be erased with a corporate decision? Xavier crossed into Indiana, the landscape unchanging but the jurisdiction different. He was a stranger now, a man between homes. The car radio played softly, news about the economy, about Reagan's policies, about unemployment numbers improving nationally, though they didn't feel improved to anyone he knew. By late afternoon, he crossed the Mississippi River into Illinois, the great waterway stretching wide beneath the bridge. Alton appeared on the bluffs ahead, a small city nestled against the river. It looked nothing like Toledo, its topography shaped by the river rather than Lake Erie, its architecture more southern than Midwestern. His new home, at least temporarily. The company had arranged an apartment in a complex that housed several other transferred employees. It was clean but sterile, furnished with basics but devoid of personality. Xavier carried in his few possessions, made the bed with sheets Audrey had packed, set Amanda's television on the dresser. He called home as promised, assuring them of his safe arrival, listening to the familiar sounds of his real home in the background. After hanging up, Xavier sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly exhausted. The room was silent except for the hum of the heating unit. No neighbors moving overhead, no familiar creaks of his own house settling, no faint sound of Amanda's stereo through the walls, just emptiness. Tomorrow he would report to the Alton plant for orientation. He would learn new machines, meet new coworkers, establish new routines. He would begin building this temporary life that would sustain them until summer. He would adapt because he had to, because that's what men like him did when challenges arose. But tonight, in this strange room in this strange city, Xavier Paxton allowed himself to mourn what had been lost. Not just a job or a paycheck, but a sense of place, of belonging, of continuity. Owens-Illinois had been more than an employer. It had been a constant in a changing world, a bedrock upon which he had built his understanding of how life worked. You gave loyalty, you received security. That equation no longer balanced, and its failure had sent ripples through everything he thought he knew. As he finally lay down to sleep, Xavier wondered what would happen to Toledo without Owens-Illinois, to the men who had no transfer option, to the city that had defined itself by its glass production for generations. And he wondered what would happen to him in this new chapter, whether he was merely a glass worker displaced or something more resilient, something that could reform like molten glass into a new shape while retaining its essential nature. The answer would come with time, as all true answers did. For now, there was tomorrow's orientation, tonight's rest, and the promise of June's reunion. It would have to be enough. The Alton plant was newer than Toledo's, its equipment more modern, its processes more automated. Xavier's first day was spent in training sessions with other transfers, learning safety protocols and plant-specific procedures. The work itself would be similar but not identical. In Alton, they specialized in food containers rather than beer bottles, with different specifications and quality standards. His new supervisor, Leanne Peters, was half his age with an engineering degree and a no-nonsense manner. "Your experience will be valuable here, Mr. Paxton," she said after reviewing his file. "We've had some quality control issues with the newer operators. I'm hoping you can help mentor them." Xavier nodded, recognizing the opportunity to make himself essential. In this new landscape, security would come not from longevity but from adaptability. "I'm happy to help however I can." The work crew was different too, more diverse than Toledo, with more women and minorities in positions that had been traditionally male and white back home. The culture felt less familial, more professional. People were friendly but not intimate. They did their jobs and went home, their real lives happening elsewhere. Xavier found himself working alongside Trevor Johnson, a young black operator who had been at the plant only 2 years. Trevor was quick but careless, missing subtle signs that Xavier had learned to detect through decades of experience. "You hear that?" Xavier asked during their second shift together, pointing to one of the forming machines. "That clicking. Something's not right with the timing." Trevor shrugged. Sounds normal to me. It's running a quarter-second slow on the close. Watch. Xavier pointed as the machine cycled, the mold closing just behind the optimal moment. If we don't adjust it, we'll start seeing defects in about an hour. Trevor looked skeptical but followed Xavier to the control panel, watching as the older man made a minute adjustment. How did you even hear that with all this noise? 27 years of listening, Xavier replied. You develop an ear for it. By the end of January, Xavier had established a routine. Weekdays were for work and solitary evenings in his apartment, where he called home nightly and tried to keep the loneliness at bay. Weekends were for exploring Alton, learning its streets, finding the best places for groceries, discovering a diner where the coffee was decent and the waitresses didn't mind if he lingered over breakfast with a newspaper. Some Saturdays he drove the 7 hours back to Toledo, arriving exhausted but grateful for even brief time with his family. These visits sustained him, though the goodbyes became no easier. Each time he returned to Alton, the apartment felt less like temporary housing and more like exile. February brought news that the Toledo plant's closure was accelerating. More lines were shutting down, more workers being laid off. Xavier's former department would cease operations entirely by April, months ahead of the original timeline. The news traveled through phone calls and letters from friends still hanging on, their futures increasingly uncertain. One such call came from Mike Trout in late February. Xavier was preparing a solitary dinner when the phone rang. "It's a ghost town now, Pax," Mike said, his voice tinny over the long-distance line. "They've got maybe 100 people left, the parking lot's empty, break rooms like a funeral home." "What about your brother's construction business?" "That working out?" Mike's sigh was audible. "It's okay, different kind of work, hard on the body in different ways, pays not as good and no union benefits, but it's something. You know what's weird? I miss the smell, that hot glass smell." "Never thought I would." Xavier knew exactly what he meant. The Alton plant smelled similar but not identical, different raw materials, different products, different ambience altogether. "How's the family holding up?" he asked. "Managing." "Sarah's picked up shifts at Kroger to help out. Kids know something's wrong but not how wrong." Mike paused. "And yours?" "Amanda's been accepted to 3 colleges so far. We're waiting to hear from 2 more before deciding. Audrey's got a part-time job at the library. We're..." Xavier searched for the right word. "Adapting." After hanging up, Xavier sat with his cooling dinner, thinking about adaptation. It was what humans did, what they had always done. When environments changed, species either adapted or perished. The glass industry was changing, Toledo was changing, and he was changing too, whether he wanted to or not. March brought a surprise. Trevor Johnson, the young operator Xavier had been mentoring, invited him to Sunday dinner at his parents' home in a predominantly black neighborhood on Alton's east side. Xavier accepted out of curiosity as much as politeness. The Johnson home was small but immaculate, with family photos covering one wall and the smell of cooking permeating everything. Trevor's parents, Raymond and Lucille, welcomed Xavier warmly, treating him more like a guest of honor than a displaced coworker of their son. "Trevor says you're teaching him things they don't cover in the training manuals," Raymond said as they sat in the living room before dinner. He was a tall man with gray at his temples and hands that showed decades of manual labor. "Just passing along what I've learned over the years," Xavier replied, uncomfortable with the praise. "That matters," Raymond said seriously. "Knowledge passed down, too often in this country, we've had to relearn everything because nobody would teach us the first time." The conversation over dinner ranged widely, from plant gossip to local politics to Trevor's young daughter, who charmed Xavier with her missing-tooth smile and endless questions. It was the first truly social evening he'd had in Alton, the first time he'd felt connected to anyone outside of work. As Raymond drove him home later, Xavier found himself asking, "Have you always worked at the plant?" Raymond shook his head. "No, I was at the steel mill until '77. Then the layoffs came, and I was one of the first to go. Spent 3 years picking up whatever work I could find before landing at Owens-Illinois. Been there 17 years now." Xavier absorbed this. "So you've been through this before, the displacement?" "Oh yes, many times. My father moved us up from Mississippi when I was 10 because the farming dried up there." Then he lost his factory job in the 60s. I lost mine in the 70s. Trevor might lose his someday too. Raymond glanced at Xavier. The difference is, I never expected anything different. White men like you grew up thinking if you worked hard and stayed loyal, you'd be taken care of. Black men never had that luxury. We always knew the rug could be pulled out any time. Xavier had never considered this perspective. His anger at Owens-Illinois had been rooted in betrayal. How could they discard loyal employees after decades of service? But for Raymond, instability wasn't a betrayal. It was the expected order of things. How do you live with that uncertainty? Xavier asked. Raymond pulled up in front of Xavier's apartment building. You build other certainties, family, community, skills that can't be taken away. The job's just a job. It's not who you are. The words echoed in Xavier's mind long after Raymond had driven away. It's not who you are, but if he wasn't a glass worker, what was he? April brought Amanda's final college decision, Ohio State University, where she'd received enough financial aid to make it workable even with their reduced circumstances. Her acceptance letter arrived at the Toledo house, and Audrey called immediately, her voice bright with excitement as she read it aloud to Xavier. They're offering her a partial scholarship plus work study, Audrey said. With what we've saved and what you're making now, we can make it work without too much debt. That's wonderful, Xavier said, genuinely relieved. This had been their primary concern, ensuring Amanda's future wasn't derailed by the corporate decision that had disrupted their lives. She wants to tell you herself, hold on. There was a rustling sound, and then Amanda's voice came on the line. Dad, I got in, and with money. Congratulations, sweetheart, I knew you could do it. I'm going to be a Buckeye. Her voice was filled with the uncomplicated joy of youth, of possibilities unfolding. And I'll only be a couple hours from home, so I can come back on weekends sometimes. Home, the word caught in Xavier's chest. Where was home now? Toledo, where his family remained. Alton, where he spent his days. Some future place they hadn't yet determined. That's great, honey. We'll talk about all the details when I come back next weekend. After the call, Xavier walked to a small park near his apartment, needing fresh air and movement. The Mississippi flowed broad and steady in the distance, a constant in a changing landscape. Xavier thought about the river, how it appeared unchanging but was actually in constant motion, never the same water from one moment to the next. Perhaps people were like that too, seemingly constant but always changing, always flowing forward. The Xavier who had punched in at the Toledo plant for the first time at 19 was not the same Xavier who had left at 46. And the Xavier sitting in this Alton park was becoming someone else entirely. May arrived with preparations for Amanda's graduation. Xavier arranged for a full week off work, the longest he'd been away from the Alton plant since starting. The anticipation of this extended family time sustained him through long shifts and lonely evenings. He arrived in Toledo on a Saturday afternoon, the familiar streets both welcoming and slightly strange after months away. The neighborhood looked the same, but subtle changes caught his eye. A new store where the old pharmacy had been, different cars in neighbors' driveways, trees fuller than he remembered. Amanda ran out to meet him as he pulled into the driveway, her excitement palpable. She looked older somehow, more adult than when he'd seen her just 3 weeks earlier. Dad, guess what? I got the campus job I applied for. I'll be working in the veterinary medicine library starting fall semester. Xavier hugged her tightly, breathing in the scent of her shampoo, feeling the vibrant energy of her youth. That's fantastic, sweetheart. I'm so proud of you. Inside, the house felt like home in a way his Alton apartment never could. Lived in, personal, filled with the accumulated evidence of their family life. Audrey had prepared his favorite meal and they sat around the kitchen table sharing news and plans. So I've been thinking, Audrey said as they finished dinner, about what happens after graduation. Xavier tensed slightly. They had been postponing this conversation for months, focusing instead on getting through the separation. The original plan was for Amanda and me to join you in Alton, Audrey continued. But with Amanda going to Ohio State in the fall, that doesn't make as much sense anymore. Xavier nodded. This had occurred to him too. I've been thinking the same thing. What if I came to Alton but we kept the house here? Amanda could live in the dorms during school terms but come home for breaks. It's so much closer to Columbus than Alton would be. It was a practical solution, though not without complications. Maintaining two residences, even temporarily, would strain their finances, and the Toledo house represented more than just shelter. It was their connection to the city, to their history there. "What about selling this place and buying something smaller near Columbus?" Xavier suggested. "Something Amanda could use during college and we could keep afterward." They discussed options late into the night, weighing practicalities against emotional attachments, immediate needs against long-term plans. No perfect solution emerged, but the conversation itself felt important. They were looking forward together, planning a future rather than just reacting to circumstances. The graduation ceremony was held at the high school football stadium on a perfect spring day. Xavier sat with Audrey in the bleachers, watching as Amanda crossed the stage in her blue cap and gown. Her name was called, she accepted her diploma, and just like that, one chapter of their family life concluded. Afterward, amid the chaos of pictures and congratulations, Xavier found himself standing slightly apart, watching Amanda with her friends. They were all vibrant with possibility, their futures wide open before them. Amanda had weathered the family's disruption with remarkable resilience, adapting to her father's absence while maintaining her grades and focus on college. "She's going to be fine," Audrey said, appearing beside him. "We raised her well." Xavier put his arm around his wife's shoulders. "We did, though I think she would have been fine regardless." "She's got your strength. And your determination," Audrey leaned against him. "We're going to be fine too, different but fine." Xavier thought about Raymond Johnson's words, "The job's just a job, it's not who you are." For the first time, he felt the truth of that statement, not just intellectually, but emotionally. The loss of his position at the Toledo plant had forced him to confront a question he'd never considered. Who was Xavier Paxton apart from his work? He was Amanda's father, guiding her toward independence. He was Audrey's husband, their partnership stronger for having weathered separation. He was a mentor to younger workers like Trevor, passing on knowledge that might otherwise be lost. He was a friend, a neighbor, a citizen. The job had never defined him, it had merely provided the stability that allowed him to be all these other things. The week in Toledo passed too quickly. Xavier and Audrey made tentative decisions about their future. She would join him in Alton after selling the house. They would look for a small place near Columbus where they could be close to Amanda during her college years, and Xavier would continue at the Alton plant until something better came along or retirement became feasible. The morning of his departure back to Alton, Xavier stood in the driveway with his family once more. But this goodbye felt different, not an exile but a temporary separation with a clear end in sight. "Just a few more weeks," Audrey said, her arms around his waist. "Then we figure out the next chapter together." Amanda hugged him fiercely. "Thanks, Dad, for everything. For making sure I could finish school here, for working so far away, just for being you." Xavier held his daughter close, memories flooding through him, her first steps, teaching her to ride a bike, helping with homework, watching her grow into the remarkable young woman now preparing to leave for college. The pride he felt had nothing to do with paychecks or job titles. It was deeper, more fundamental. As he drove back to Alton, Xavier found himself thinking not about what had been lost when Owens-Illinois downsized, but about what remained. The company had provided a livelihood, and for that he was grateful. But his worth, his identity, his purpose, those came from elsewhere. The American industrial landscape was changing, and Toledo was changing with it. The certainties of previous generations no longer held, but adaptation wasn't just about survival, it was about growth, about discovering new aspects of oneself when circumstances demanded it. Xavier Paxton had been a glass worker for 27 years. Now he was becoming something else, something with fewer certainties but perhaps more possibilities. The road ahead was neither straight nor clearly marked, but he wasn't traveling it alone, and that made all the difference. 10 years later, Xavier stood at the entrance to what had once been the Owens-Illinois plant in Toledo. The massive structure had been partially demolished, partially repurposed into smaller industrial spaces and offices. The iconic smokestack with the OI logo was long gone, erased from the skyline as if it had never dominated the Toledo landscape. He was back in the city for Amanda's veterinary school graduation from Ohio State. His daughter had fulfilled her childhood dream, specializing in large animal medicine with plans to work in rural practice. Xavier and Audrey had ultimately settled in Columbus after his retirement from the Alton plant 5 years earlier, drawn by proximity to Amanda and the city's more diverse economy. The Toledo they returned to periodically was not the Toledo they had left. The loss of Owens-Illinois had been just one in a series of blows to the city's industrial base. Other manufacturers had followed suit, downsizing, relocating, closing altogether. The population had declined, neighborhoods had changed, the very identity of the glass city had been forced to evolve. Yet there were signs of renewal too. The university had expanded, healthcare had grown as a sector, young entrepreneurs were repurposing old industrial spaces for new ventures. It wasn't the same city, but it wasn't dead either, just different, adapting in its own way just as its former residents had adapted. Xavier walked the perimeter of the old plant, memories surfacing with each step. Here was where he had parked every day for nearly 3 decades. There was the employee entrance where he'd first arrived as a 19-year-old, nervous and eager to prove himself worthy of his father's recommendation. Around the corner was where the men gathered for cigarettes during breaks, sharing news and complaints and jokes in equal measure. The buildings themselves were altered beyond recognition, windows replaced, facades modernized, interiors reconfigured for new purposes. Nothing remained of the machinery that had once filled these spaces, the furnaces, the IS machines, the conveyors that had carried millions of bottles to pallets and then to the world beyond. Xavier felt no sadness at the transformation. The plant had served its purpose in its time, just as he had served his. Both had changed because change was inevitable. The glass bottles once produced here had been temporary vessels designed to contain something of value before being discarded or recycled into something new. Perhaps there was a lesson in that. He turned away from the old plant and walked to his car, where Audrey waited patiently. They had a dinner reservation with Amanda and her fiancé, a fellow veterinary student she had met in her second year of the program. "How was it?" Audrey asked as he slid into the driver's seat. "Different, completely different." Xavier started the engine. "But that's okay, things change, we changed too." Audrey reached across to squeeze his hand. "For the better, I think." Xavier nodded, putting the car in gear and pulling away from the curb. As they drove through Toledo toward the restaurant, he reflected on the journey that had brought them here, the shock of displacement, the pain of separation, the uncertainty of starting over, and ultimately the discovery that resilience wasn't about resisting change but about flowing with it, like the Mississippi past Alton, like the molten glass in the furnaces where he had spent his working life. What had happened in Toledo when Owens-Illinois left thousands jobless was not just an ending but a beginning, painful, unwanted, but a beginning nonetheless. For the city, for the workers, for Xavier Paxton, who had learned that while jobs might define how you spend your days, they never truly define who you are.